a professor of economics at the University of Newcastle in New South Wales. And he's one of the early developers of modern monetary theory. And I understand that Karl Marx is one of the key influences in his thinking. And I just wanted to perhaps start really, Bill, if you could just kind of set out the basic principles of modern monetary theory. I've been very kind of inspired by it and feel that it's an essential tool for socialists to embrace, because I think it offers huge opportunities for a progressive economic program. But I wonder if you could maybe, for people who are not too familiar with modern monetary theory, if you could just sort of set out the basic principles as a start of a 10.
Sure. Well, good evening and or good day for you guys, and thanks for inviting me. Sunday night talking economics. Way to go. Look, modern monetary theory is what I would call essential to anybody who wants to who values democracy and wants to participate in an open way in democracy, because the essence of MMT is that it's I wander around the world saying it's a lens. It's a framework for understanding the system, the monetary system we have in most of our countries, and the capacities of the currency issue within that monetary system. So a lot of people I see on Twitter or social media saying, those again say, oh, it'll be terrible if we ever move to MMT. And those four say, won't it be wonderful when we move to MMT? Of course, both statements are fundamentally wrong, because we've already, it's a way of understanding what's already out there, how the system already operates. And the problem that we've had is that the mainstream of my profession, macroeconomics, has created what I call a fictional world. And this fictional world is all of these interlinked myths that are designed to suppress government policy action to benefit the well-being of most of us, and concentrated to benefit the few. What modern monetary theory allows you to understand is that there's a fundamental difference between a household and the currency issuing government. You and I are households, and we've got to go out to earn income if we want to spend, or we have to borrow if we want to spend more than our income, whatever. But we're financially constrained. The government isn't financially constrained like the British government. And what that means is that we use their currency. And what that means is that the British government can buy whatever's for sale in British pounds without question, including all idle labour. And that means just that simple statement is incredibly powerful, because what that means is that if you've got mass unemployment like you've got now, that's a policy choice. It's not a financial constraint. And we've been led to believe it's a financial constraint, that if the governments do this, they'll push up bond yields, and the city, in your context, will send the government broke. They'll stop buying their bonds, and inflation will occur. All these interlinked myths that are designed to stop us making political demands on our elected officials. And modern monetary theory basically blows through all of those myths and opens up the landscape for open debate.
I mean, and the flexibility, I mean, that governments like the British government have now, are they kind of linked, are they not, to the fact that it is now a fiat currency since 1971? I mean, as I understand it, Britain came off the gold standard in 1931 and signed up to, is it the Bretton Woods Agreement in the 1940s, linking the pound to the dollar. But I think since for 50 years, near enough, it's been a floating currency, which is, I mean, that's what gives us the flexibility, isn't it? That we don't have to, as it were, match the any kind of public spending with some physical kind of tangible sort of commodity like gold or whatever. I mean, could you maybe just sort of unpack that a little bit for people?
I mean, the thing is that most of the sort of economics that you hear now is a relic of the period, post-war period up until about the early 70s. And that was the Bretton Woods system, the fixed exchange rate system, which meant that all the countries that were signatories to that post-war so-called consensus for financial stability, all of those governments that signed up, their central banks had to maintain the value, the agreed value of their currency against the US dollar, which in turn was then linked in value to gold. And that was considered to anchor the system to a precious metal. And what that meant was that the anything that influenced the amount of currency that was in circulation could influence its value in the foreign exchange markets and could compromise the central bank's target achievement of keeping the British pound aligned to the dollar as agreed. There were some bands around which it could fluctuate, but not very much. And so if you ran government deficits, for example, which was pushing in pounds to the economy, into the monetary system, and if that was considered to be too much supply relative to the demand of the British pound would start to fall in value, and that would compromise the central bank. So the way the governments were able to manage fiscal policy was to issue debt, which would drain those pounds out of the system again if they were in excess. And so the whole purpose was to make sure that the fixed exchange rate target wasn't compromised. And so we had a whole series of policy tools and conventions that were centered around that whole system. Now, in August, that system was collapsing during the 60s. It was never going to be sustainable because of its architecture and the role of the US dollar as the reserve currency. And by the 60s, the French started to worry first that they wanted to convert their dollar holdings because, of course, the US government had to run trade deficits to supply all these dollars into the system so that they could be used in trade deals, etc. And the French particularly were worried that the dollar would lose value if they kept holding it. And so they wanted to convert it into gold. And of course, there wasn't enough gold to go around. And so and the British government, of course, was, and all the governments that were running external deficits were in real trouble during the 60s because they were always facing downward pressure on their exchange rate because of the deficits meant there was excess supply of their currency into the markets relative to demand. And so the only way they could cope was to run high interest rate regimes or fiscal austerity regimes, both of which caused domestic unemployment to be higher than it otherwise should be. Yeah. And so in a political sense, it was not sustainable because of the political instability. You could only countries like Germany that were running big deficits weren't under any domestic pressure like that, political pressure. And of course, you know your British history better than I, but the 60s was a terrible time for Britain with its power, the revaluations. And in the end, what they really, the Americans pulled the plug anyway, because they were going to run out of gold because the French wanted all this gold. And so in August 1971, President Nixon just closed it all down. Now, most countries left then. Europe paddled on because they had to, because of their common agricultural policy required fixed exchange rates within the community. Otherwise, it would have been too complex and it would have broken down itself. And so they kept trying to do the impossible, and the ultimate manifestation of that's the Eurozone, where they've really pushed that belief that they could sustain fixed exchange rates across all of that block. Ridiculous, they can't, and that's why you're now getting such divergence across the 19 member states. And most countries abandoned that early 70s. Australia didn't abandon it until 1983, but we kept running what was called a managed float, but it was unsustainable. Now, once that happened, central banks no longer had to worry about the exchange rate. domestic policy was freed up then to pursue unambiguously to pursue well-being, and all of the external imbalances would adjust through the exchange rate.
And yet politicians still seem to be living in the past, don't they? I mean, I'm old enough to remember, for example, Dennis Healey going to the IMF in 1976 on the, as I remember it, the pretext, you know, Britain was sort of going bankrupt, running out of money. And it was the year I joined the Labour Party, and Jim Callaghan made a speech at the Labour Party conference. I've got a quote here with what he said. He said, "We used to think we could spend our way out of a recession and increase employment by cutting taxes and boosting government spending. I tell you, in all candor, that option no longer exists." And Healey was on the way to the IMF, actually, and turned around at the airport and came back to make a speech to the Labour Party conference, where he got heckled and a lot of opposition to what he was saying, because it meant an end to the alternative economic strategy that the Labour Party was seeking to put into place, as it were, with the 1974 manifesto. Talked about an irreversible shift in the balance of wealth and power. But the argument was, look, we need this, you know, we're running out of money, as I remember it, and I'd be interested in your take on this, Bill, in a moment. And I think we ended up borrowing £3.9 billion from the International Monetary Fund. And the argument went that, you know, they were fearful that investors, you know, the bond market would crash. You know, inflation was relatively high then, and so we wouldn't be able to sell government bonds. But that's all a load of baloney. So we don't need to sell government bonds anyway, do we? Can't we? I mean, you've talked about over monetary financing. I wonder if you could maybe just give your take on that era, that period, which still seems to pervade to this day the thinking of all the major political parties in this country. It's almost as if we've never left the Bretton Woods Agreement. We're still, you know, we're still subject to it. And I'd be just interested in your take on that, and why you think politicians are still so constrained. And have I got that right about the point in relation to the bond market? And you know, does it matter if people, you know, won't buy bonds? Do we need to sell bonds? I mean, as I understand it, we don't win a fiat currency. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot there. If you go back to the, you know, the second Wilson government in Britain, already elements, Britain was already embracing the emerging monetarism. If you go back to even earlier in the Heath government, before the Wilson government, they brought, the Bank of England tried monetary targeting, the triple C policy that came in, I think, in 71 from memory. And because Friedman had told them the only way they should operate was to run monetary targets. And the Bank of England would become, central banks were the first ones to become infested with the monetarism that was coming out of the American Academy. And that policy, in the triple C policy, was abandoned very quickly, because it was they soon realised that the central bank couldn't control the money supply. They had to make sure there were enough reserves in the financial system, otherwise it'd go bust. And so they abandoned that. And I can't remember what the policy was called, but you'll remember they then went on a stimulus policy in the last year before Heath lost to Wilson. Now, as part of that shift in psyche, characters like Dennis Healey were becoming infested with monetarism. And a group, you know better than me, that within the Labor Party at the time, there was severe divisions emerging between sort of Healey's monetarist conservative gang and Tony Benn's sort of intervention. And there were all manipulations of ministries to get rid of Ben and isolate him and all of that. And what Healey wanted to do was basically impose austerity. His plan, he had a delicate balancing act, because he didn't want to kill off the social contract with the unions at the time. He wasn't really prepared, as I understand it, to do a Thatcher and just kill the unions. And so he had to walk a fine line with the social contract. But he was a monetarist by then, and he wanted to do the austerity route. And it's quite interesting, because a lot of people
think that Maggie Thatcher was the first monetarist government, but it wasn't. It was Callaghan and Healey were the first monetarist government. It was the Labor Party that brought that sort of austerity mindset into British politics and world politics, really, because the French followed in '83, but that we'll come back to that later. But the point was that Healey had to work out a tactic to not jettison the social contract, but at the same time be able, he needed, in Reclaiming the State, we talk about depoliticisation and the way in which these neoliberal governments have sussed out that they can appeal to an external source so they don't have to be taking the direct responsibility for something they want to do. And Healey worked out that if he said to the British, to the Labor Party and to the trade unions that we're running out of money, we've got to go to the IMF and get a standing facility with the IMF, then he could say the IMF are telling us to do this, and that would give him cover, political cover, so that then he could keep the social contract discussions going with the unions. That was what that was all about, as far as my understanding is. Now, I don't even believe from memory they actually drew on that standing facility, by the way.
No, I think they did, actually.
I think they got an agreement from the IMF that they could draw down on it, but they never did because they never intended to. Healey knew damn well that the British government issues the pound. The fancy saying to the British people, we're running out of pounds. We've got to go to the IMF to get pounds.
But that mentality still pervades to this day. I mean, and Healey, I think, subsequently said, I think he recanted on the decision to go to the IMF after, obviously, long after he'd retired, and said that the Treasury officials, you know, were far too pessimistic in the advice that they gave him. But you know, that mentality still pervades to this day. It's even, in my opinion, affected the thinking of the, you know, the Corbyn leadership in that sense, and which obviously definitely generated so much hope. But just going back to the issue about bonds, though, Bill, I wonder if you could just sort of say a little bit more about that, because I've heard you refer to it. It's a lovely phrase, and I've often used it myself since I heard you use it, where you referred to it as corporate welfare. And I just think it'd be quite important if you could just kind of set out why you refer to it in that way, because I think a lot of people are labouring under a misapprehension, you know, that, you know, the bond market's absolutely essential, and that we desperately need, you know, billionaires to be able to deliver our programs.
Well, if you want to buy a house when you're younger, you've got to go to a bank and borrow money to get a mortgage, because your income isn't sufficient to pay the house, and you pay it off over time. So as householders, we're constrained. If we want to spend more than we earn or we can get from other sources, like running down savings, selling assets that we currently own, we have to borrow. Now, the British government issues the pound, and it never has to borrow. And in effect, and as this is a sort of a technical point, it's really, when it does issue gilts to the market, it's really only borrowing back money that it's spent into the economy anyway. Now, we'll leave that aside. That makes it clear. But here's an example of the corporate welfare angle. In 1996, the Conservative government in Australia started running surpluses. They were elected and they started running surpluses. They deregulated the financial markets further, and lots of households started to get letters addressed to children with $20,000 Visa card invitations. So there was this massive financial engineering push once the market was deregulated to lend money to everybody. And that kept the economy growing. The credit household debt went from 60% of disposable income to about 180%. And that's why the economy kept growing, even though the government was starting to run surpluses. Now, by the end of the century, the bond market, Australian government bond market, had become very thin. That means there weren't many bonds available for trading, because the government, when they came due, didn't renew them. because bonds have a maturity date and they roll and they get paid out, and then the government issues new debt. And who do you think complained about that? Well, who complained was the Sydney Futures Exchange and all the big investment banks. And they forced the government to have an inquiry. I was an expert witness, and I was the only one with Warren Mosler who said the government should just stop issuing this debt. What the government agreed was that it would continue to issue a minimum amount of debt to satisfy the demands for that debt from the financial markets. Now, when you sort of said, you put together two pieces of logic, they're meant to be running, they're running surpluses. So according to the mainstream logic, they don't need to issue the debt, yet they agreed to keep issuing debt. So then you have to ask, well, what was the debt for? Well, you know what it was for. It was to provide a risk-free asset for the financial markets upon which they can run into when they get a bit uncertain about their other products, and they use that risk-free asset as the benchmark to then price all their other products that they go and flog off to investors. And so it's a safe haven, a guaranteed annuity, a safe haven for the speculators in the financial market. That's the corporate welfare angle. It doesn't serve us. It doesn't help us.
We don't need to sell bonds. We don't need to sell government debt. No. We can just engage in, I think, something you've referred to as overt monetary financing. Is that right?
Look, you think about what's. I did some analysis the other day of how much the Bank of England, what proportion of gilts that are being issued as the Bank of England's buying. Think about the Bank of Japan. The government's been running huge deficits for years. And the Bank of Japan, let's say since 2012, the Bank of Japan has basically bought all of the debt that's been issued. And the Federal Reserve in America, the same. The Reserve Bank in Australia has started buying government bonds now in the crisis. So it's already bought about 60% of all the debt that's been issued since this current crisis, and it will keep buying and buying and buying. This is the left pocket.
When we talk about debt, because it's kind of, it's money that we owe to ourselves, because doesn't the Bank of England sometimes buy up government debt?
Well, that's what I'm saying. The Bank of England is furiously buying gilts now, and I call it the right pocket and the left pocket of government.
Yeah,
the bank is the left pocket or the right, doesn't matter which side, and the Treasury is the other one. And so the Treasury is issuing the debt, the bank's buying, central bank's buying it, and all these transactions ultimately are just within government. It's absolutely meaningless.
I read in the financial press in this country, I think it was a couple of weeks or so ago. Obviously, the government's been spending a lot more than they anticipated, and so on, and they've been issuing government bonds. And it said, I think it was in the Financial Times, that the bond yields have gone negative. People are getting less back than what they paid for, which is interesting, considering the history of what's happened and over the last sort of 50 years or so since Britain's come out of the Bretton Woods Agreement, and that flexibility never seems to have been embraced. I mean,
and in some countries, investors are lending 10, 15 years at negative interest rates. What that means for your audience is that investors are queuing up to buy British government bonds and paying the British government the privilege to buy them so that they'll make a certain loss at the end of when the maturity comes up. Now, you just got to wonder, and last year in my last time I was in Europe, I spoke to a lot of the big pension funds and the big investment banks in Europe, like PIMCO and places, organisations like this. And what they were telling me was that the way in which these yields are going negative is undermining their whole business model. And what they want is not austerity from fiscal policy, they want fiscal expansion and big infrastructure projects, because that's how they can leverage their investment funds and get returns to their investors. And it gets even more sinister than that, because you might say, well, what the hell, who cares about the investment banks? But think about the pension funds. Their problem now is that there's negative yields everywhere going on, and they've got to deliver cash every month on their liabilities, their pensions that they've got to pay out, and their assets aren't delivering enough return now to pay those. So they're increasingly shifting into more and more risky assets. And so a lot of these big pension funds are on the brink of insolvency. That's how stupid this whole system has become.
Yeah, yeah. And just going back again to the kind of modern day Labour Party thinking, which, as I say, I don't think has particularly moved on, regrettably. And there's still this notion that in terms of delivering a modest socialist program, that we need to tax the rich. We've got to clamp down on the tax havens, and I'm not saying we shouldn't do that. But I mean, that's a misunderstanding, isn't it? I remember John McDonnell, that is, when he was the Shadow Chancellor, making a really amusing quip about the Conservative Party manifesto, because the Labour's Treasury team had produced a compendium document to go along with the manifesto, which identified every area of expenditure that was committed in the manifesto, where that was going to be raised through additional taxes, excuse me, on increasing corporation tax, the transaction tax, range of things. I think they were talking about increasing the top rate and so on. But again, that's a misunderstanding, isn't it, of how the government raises its resources in a country like Britain with its own sovereign currency, is it not?
Yeah, I remember when I met with John in, when was it, October 2018? I think I had a meeting in London with John and his advisors. Yeah. And one of the points I made to John was that the Labor Party, as expressed by him and his advisors, hadn't really learned anything since 1976. Mm. That's what I said to him. That you haven't really learned anything since Healy and Callaghan tried to pull that stunt in 76. You're still worrying about the City of London killing the pound. And, then one of his advisors said, oh, well, the city is so big, the financial system's so big in Britain. And I said to him, yeah, it's about 6% of GDP. And I said, do you know what size the financial system is in Australian GDP? He said, oh, tiny. I said about 6%.
Yeah, yeah.
And these guys just have this irrational paranoia about the capacity of the British financial system to kill governments. What I've learned from talking to some of the biggest investors around the world, the big infrastructure investors and the big banks and the guys who really put the money out, is that they want stable government, educated workforce, rule of law, contractual certainty, so that they don't invest money and it just gets taken off by some capricious leader. And they want big investment projects. They don't give a stuff whether there's deficits or what. They understand that if their money's safe and there's things for their money to do, they're not going to sell off the pound. Think about Australia. We've been running mostly deficits, and our pound fluctuates. And when our pound has gone down the most, we've been running surpluses. And if you do any rigorous economic studies, there's no systematic relationship between the fiscal position and movements in the exchange rate. None at all. Yeah. And those guys have just never got past the mid-70s. That's the problem for the Labor Party.
And my concern as well with that stance is that it bestows a status on the super rich, the likes of Alan Sugar, who claim that they will leave the country if a Labour government, wherever, elected under Jeremy Corbyn anyway. And my response at meetings I ever attended was, well, good, let them go, drive them to the airport, but there is that sense, and that somehow, we desperately need these wealthy people to be able to deliver a socialist program. And if you run away, we won't be able to raise the resources that we need. But I think you very clearly outlined there that is just an absolute myth. But
it's quite extraordinary, I reckon. If you think about you know, Ayn Rand, at Atlas Shrugged, the right-wing Bible, talks about how important the big bosses are. All these progressives that talk about we've got to tax the rich to fund basic services like NHS in Britain, they're just committing the same error. We might want to, as you say, we might want to tax the rich, and I'm on the public record as saying we should increase taxes on higher income groups to reduce their power, to reduce their ability to buy lobbyists and to disproportionately influence the political dialogue through the media and what have you. But we never want to tax the rich to get their money. The British government can fund the NHS up to its desired state. It never has to tax the rich to get the money, and progressives should separate those 2 points and not conflate them, because they walk into a major error by doing that.
No, I agree, and I've certainly seen, and it was less pronounced, I think, when John was the Shadow Chancellor, but certainly when Balls was Ed Balls was heading up the Shadow Treasury team, and Chris Leslie, who coined the term Corbynomics, actually, when Richard Murphy was working alongside Jeremy. But unfortunately, Richard never got brought into the inner circle, and I think a lot of people expected that he would be. You know, as I say, the hope and expectation that we would be considerably different, I think, to what had gone before, was snatched away from us, and that sort of thinking, as we've just said, seems to continue to influence.
Yeah, I mean, you just have to go back to the lead up to the last election campaign. That when I met John the year before, I said to him, you're ring fencing yourself, you're putting yourself in a straitjacket by this stupid set of fiscal rules that they had. They'd got a few neoliberal economists to give them these fiscal rules. And at the time I said to him, those fiscal rules are unsustainable. They just set you up to fail, because you can't possibly run your program with those rules. And it was interesting, in the lead up to the last election, they altered the rule exactly the way I told them they had to alter it. Because, and they didn't say much, but the problem was the damage was already done.
No, indeed. I remember having a conversation about the fiscal credibility, so-called fiscal credibility rule, that suggested that they would reduce the deficit, and that would be the absolute overriding priority. But there was some flexibility in an emergency, as we're perhaps experiencing now with COVID, but or something else that comes along. But the power to break the fiscal credibility rule was ceded to the Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee. It wasn't even the Chancellor that would have been able to.
Yeah, I mean, exactly a neoliberal stunt, and you know, one of his advisors said, "Oh, well, during the crisis, we would, the Treasurer, John would, if he was the Chancellor, would just take control." I said, well, during the GFC, the Bank of England never, you go through their minutes, the Bank of England never once said that they'd reached a point where monetary policy had lost traction. Even at the worst parts of the GFC. You know, Simon Wren-Lewis and the advisors were raving on about zero bounds all the time, and that would be the point where the Chancellor could take control again. But the Bank of England never admitted once during the GFC that they had lost control of monetary policy. So in other words, even the logic of their own logic, John would have never, if he was the Chancellor during the GFC, he would have never been able to suspend the rules of language and take over. So it was just a nonsensical straitjacket. And it was all to do with this fact that they had to feel as though they had to be credible with the City of London. It was stupid.
I mean, some of the criticisms and concerns that's been expressed to me about MMT, because I've tried to sort of promote it as best I can.
Good on you.
But they talk about the possibility of a hyperinflation risk, and they cite the post World War I Germany and Zimbabwe. obviously Germany in the post-World War I with the reparations, which I understand had to be paid in gold, and then the French occupied the Ruhr Valley and massively undermined Germany's productive capacity. There were very, very special circumstances, as I think there were in Zimbabwe. And then the other thing which has been put to me about MMT by people in the Treasury team is that, yeah, it's all very good idea. However, it won't work in Britain because we don't issue the dollar. It can only work in the States because the US dollar is a reserve currency. What's your thoughts on those 2 points, Bill, about inflation and this issue about not being applicable in the UK because we're not a reserve currency?
Well, I've been doing this for a long time, and I've been doing it for long enough so that the audience has changed its examples from Weimar to Zimbabwe. That's how long I've been doing it.
Yeah.
And I say to them, okay, well, what do you know about Zimbabwe? And they say, oh, there was hyperinflation. I say, well, what else do you know? Oh, there were big deficits. I say, well, what else do you know? Silence.
Mm.
And and the same argument could be made about the Weimar period in the 1920s. And what transpires about Zimbabwe, of course, is that Robert Mugabe wanted to reward his freedom fighters who had liberated the country from Rhodesia, from the white rule. And he also wanted to change the dramatically inequitous land holdings, which were biased against the local population. So admirable motivations, but stupid strategy. He took over the white farms.
Yeah.
And the white farms were the food bowl of Asia. The white farmers were incredibly efficient farmers. And the freedom fighters knew nothing about farming. And within a very short period, farm output collapsed by more than 60%. And then because of the food shortage, the Central Bank of Zimbabwe wouldn't give the manufacturers foreign currency loans to buy imported capital. So their manufacturing contracted dramatically. And so what you learn about Zimbabwe is that it's a dramatic supply side contraction.
Mm.
The Zimbabwean government could have been running fiscal surpluses at that time, and you would have had hyperinflation.
Yeah.
Could have been running surpluses because the demand side and the supply side became grossly mismatched because of a collapse in supply, not the acceleration of demand. Spending.
And what about this point about the reserve currency? Could you just kind of tackle that myth, as I think it is, that Britain's not the pound sterling is not a reserve currency, so you can't apply MMT sort of.
Yeah, but to go back to my opening comment, you don't apply MMT; it already is.
Indeed, but you can't use that lens.
No, Britain's running Britain is an MMT economy.
Yeah.
It's just that if you're a non-MMT, you don't see what I see about the British economy, and you don't understand the capacities. Look, the point is that the British government issues the pound. Nobody else issues the pound. And so anything that's for sale in pounds, even whether it's a reserve currency or not, can be bought by the British government, including all idle labour. Now, the important point to understand, I think, is that what people get confused by is saying, oh, well, everything will be okay then. Well, no. What MMT understanding lets you understand is that while the British government can buy whatever's for sale in the pound, including all idle labour, if there's not much for sale, well, it can't buy much. And so if you've got a poor country in Africa that's got very few productive resources, what the government with its own currency can ensure is that all those productive resources will be fully employed, but that mightn't deliver very much material prosperity. That's the point. And so countries, all countries can, who issue their own currency, can always use that currency to buy resources that are available and make sure there's full employment, always, whether it's a reserve currency or not. That's just a furphy.
And just one final, because we're getting inundated with lots of questions, Bill, from viewers, which is encouraging. But just one final point, if I may, that's been put to me to try and sort of denigrate MMT as a socialist is that using an MMT lens is merely all about propping up, another way of propping up capitalism. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, well, look, when I was from a very young age, as an academic, I've been criticised by my fellow Marxists for proposing palliatives to capitalism.
Yeah.
And what I reply, and there's this great song by a band I love called the Brooklyn Funk Essentials. They're a New York sort of cooperative band. It's sort of jazz funk band. They're great. And they've got a song, "The Revolution was postponed because of rain." And the song's about all these groovy Marxists
Yes.
who want to have a revolution, but something just happens to always get in the way. Like there's a big game on TV, or they're too blown out to go out, all that. And then what I say to people is that, look, I'll be on the front line when the revolution comes. Don't worry about that. I'll mount the picket and I'll be an attack dog just like you want. But in the meantime, until we can organise the revolution, people out there are suffering without jobs, without incomes, without good public services, and I would prefer to offer palliatives to them while we sit in cafes with our croissants and our coffees talking about the revolution.
I coined a phrase, Bill, when I was leader of the council in Derby. There were many things that I didn't like the new Labour that was in office when I was leader of the council in Derby. Many things that they were imposing which I disagreed with and the Labour group disagreed with. But I coined a phrase which was innovative pragmatism, and essentially sort of trying to, look, we haven't got our hands on all the levers. Let's make the best of the situation and try and bend, policy that we don't particularly agree with to reflect our own priorities in that sense. And I see MMT in that way, frankly, and I think it is.
I think as good socialists, we should be caring about the moment.
Yep.
Now. Look around us. Are we going to have a revolution in Britain tomorrow? No way. Are we going to have a revolution in 10 years in Britain? Maybe, maybe not. But there's people suffering in the street. There's people without good housing. There's people without a job. There's people without adequate health care, without proper education. And as good socialists, the moment says we should do whatever we can now. And if that forestalls the revolution by a day or two, I'm going to be pretty happy about that.
Well, I'm with you on that. And I think, for me, MMT, there was a light bulb moment when I was sort of exposed to MMT. And I just think it's an incredible tool that should be embraced by socialists for the reasons that you've just outlined, really, because I think it does give you the ability to be able to, deliver a progressive program. And it gets you out of that hole that I was going to go on to, and I got myself sidetracked when people like Ed Balls and others and Chris Leslie went on the TV. The first question they were asked by the commentators, the interviewers, was, "Where are you going to make the cuts? You're going to spend on this. How are you going to raise the money? What are you going to cut? And it always put them on the back foot. Well,
how are you going to?
This MMT gives you the very, very effective answer. Listen, Bill, we better move on. And I was going to ask you about the job guarantee scheme, but there's somebody that actually asked a question which I think you can kind of bring in the job guarantee scheme, which I think, looking at some of the things you've written and interviews you've given in the past, where I think it was the wool price stabilization scheme in Australia that kind of, with a bit of lateral thinking, gave you the idea about a job guarantee scheme. And maybe you could perhaps talk a little bit about that. But there's a question here from a guy called Chris Linton, who posed a question to me a few years ago when I was speaking in Barrow in Furness. And he's asking basically about universal basic income. He says, considering the economic downfall from this pandemic, is it time to introduce a universal basic income set at a livable wage and with rent caps to accompany it? What do you think about that, Bill? And perhaps you could talk about a job guarantee scheme in response to that particular question about UBI.
Look, as people who read my work know, I'm very opposed to progressives embracing a universal basic income. I think it's a neoliberal construction. Now, why I say that is because if you go back in the literature, these ideas emerged when unemployment was still very high after the 1990s recession. And progressives started to believe the line that governments were pushing, that, oh, they can't do anything about these jobs. You know, we can't do anything about unemployment. And so progressives started to say, okay, well, we have to do something about the poverty that the unemployment creates. And if the unemployment can't be resolved by governments, then what we want is a guaranteed income to resolve the poverty. And as soon as you take that position, you're conceding that the government doesn't have a role to play in generating full employment. That's what the neoliberals have wanted us to accept, that we've got to tolerate some unemployment, that the government can't create jobs for us. Well, quite clearly, the government can create as many jobs as ever required if it wants to. It's a political choice that they don't. And I would never surrender to the proposition that they can't. That's the first point. The second point is that universal basic income really reconstructs us as individuals, not as part of a collective. And a good socialist talks about collectives and our role to play within the collective, give or take. And the UBI constructs us as what I call individual consumption units. And so it's saying, oh, well, we'll have a dollop of income to you because we're not going to give you a job anymore, and that'll keep you consuming, and then just go away, leave us alone. That absolves the governments of any of its responsibilities under the human rights agreements and the ILO agreements that the governments would provide enough work for all. Now, the third thing then is that, you know, I hear it all the time. I just want to do my art. You know, leave me to do my art. And there's this idea that if everyone is allowed to get a basic income, a huge mushrooming of creativity will evolve. Now, what sociologists tell us about unemployment, and this is related to the culture of our societies, is that unemployment is an incredibly disabling state for an individual to be in, because their social network shrinks, they lose their self-esteem and their position of their feeling of where they sit in society, which you get from work. And that's our culture still. We haven't changed that. And the other point about, I just want to do my art. Oh yeah, you want to be able to do your art. And this relates back to the collective. But who's going to provide the art materials for you? Who's going to provide the food that you eat and the electricity that you consume and all of that? Someone has to work. So as a collective, we should be all contributing in the way we can. And the final point I'd make, and this brings us into a job guarantee, if you just pay people universal basic income, if you pay it at a wage that would be at an income that would be reasonable, well, then the government is effectively spending at what I call market prices. Now, what does that mean? That's jargon. What does it mean? It means that the government's giving you or me a UBI, and we're going out with that government spending and buying things and competing in the market. Now, if you've then got an inflationary episode, how does the government deal with that? Well, it deals with it by contractionary policy, by pushing up taxes, reducing spending, whatever. And the way they resolve the inflationary pressure is by creating unemployment. That's how it happens under this orthodoxy. Yeah. So if you just impose a UBI, whenever you get unemployment, all you're doing is maintaining that orthodoxy that inflation control comes about through unemployment. And I really resist that. Why? Because I think you can do it through an employment buffer stock through a job guarantee. And so I'd prefer to solve poverty by giving everybody a meaningful job at a socially inclusive wage. And the government stands ready to give anybody a job at that wage. Now, how does that control? That solves poverty. It solves the cultural issues that we still believe that work's important. When none of our societies are ready to allow people to do nothing and just get an income. No, that's not going to happen. And so a job guarantee provides a job for anybody who wants it. So you eliminate unemployment effectively, except for those shifting between jobs. You eliminate unemployment benefits because everyone's now able to get a job at a social inclusive wage. And you control inflation because if there is inflation and you need to tighten policy, all that will happen is workers shift into the job guarantee. They don't become unemployed. And I think I think then you've got a vehicle to have big debates in society about what's productive, what's meaningful work, and you can, by the type of jobs that the government allows to become into job guarantee under pressure from us, you start to broaden the concept of what work is and what's contribution to society, and you become much more progressive. That's why I prefer a job guarantee.
Right. No, thank you. We've had quite a few questions that's asking about UBI, so that's a very full answer, and hopefully that's actually dealt with all the queries that were raised on universal basic income. There's one here from somebody called Z Gray, and they're saying, when you say the British state issues the pound, are there limitations on how much they can issue? Would it not impact on exchange rates if there is an increase in pounds in the market?
Well, it's unlimited how much they can issue. And take two scenarios to really get to understand. Scenario one is what you've got now, lots of idle resources, lots of productive resources not being used. Ask yourself the question, what constraints are there on the British government to spend? And the answer is none. It's got no financial constraints because it issues the pound. It can type numbers into bank accounts with as many zeros as it likes. But think about it in terms of those real resources, the productive resources. It can keep spending until all those productive resources are being fully employed. Now, take scenario two, we start at that point. Scenario two is where you've got all your productive resources employed, and then you ask yourself, what are the constraints on government spending, British government spending in that context? Well, there's no financial constraints, but if the government then wants to buy up more of those resources, say to have a green transition or something, then it's got a problem because all those resources are currently being used. And so how can it deal with that? Because if it goes in there and tries to expand the government's use of those resources, it'll be competing at market prices and pushing up inflation. And so it's got to do another thing there. It's got what MMT calls a real resource constraint, because they're already being used, and it's got to work out a way, if it wants to use more itself, to stop the current users using them. Now, how might it do that? There's a number of ways, but taxes is an important way. And so suddenly you get in the understanding that taxes aren't to fund the spending, they're to allow the government to force us to use, because it reduces our purchasing power. We can't use the real resources as much. And that allows the government to spend more, bring those resources into the public sector without causing inflation. Now, as long as it's behaving in that way, more or less, and producing opportunities for investors to leverage off, like in infrastructure projects, go back to what I said earlier, then there won't be a run on the pound, there won't be inflation, there won't be fears of having to get out of the pound because it'll lose value. That's the important insight of MMT. How much should the government spend? As much as necessary to create full employment, and not a penny more.
Right, yeah. We're running short of time now, but just a couple here, if I may, Bill. This one's from Max Cowell. He's saying he's hoping for a massive investment into manufacturing of sustainable goods, renewables, electric cars, etc. Would this have been possible? Would we need capital controls, he's saying? And this kind of linked to one that Paul's asked about, are there any impacts relating to the fourth industrial revolution of of embracing MMT.
Yep. The point about capital controls is that sometimes capital controls may be necessary if you have an incredible speculative run on your currency. So think about Iceland. It had during the GFC, it had the biggest banking collapse in history, and it faced financial devastation and its exchange rate dropping to who knows how low. And its government was very sensible and imposed capital controls, tied up two of the largest American hedge funds, couldn't get their money out, and successfully defended their currency. So in extreme circumstances, you may need capital controls, and even the IMF is admitting that now. For years, they railed against them. That's the first point. Second point about green transitions or big structural transformations of your economy that we're going to have. We're going to have to change our production and consumption patterns to be less carbon intensive. And I think what this pandemic has generated in all of our countries is this idea that being dependent on global supply chains for everything isn't a very good idea if you can't get basic health goods and things like that because you've got to import them. So I think there will be a major push from all sides of politics in all countries to build more self-sustainability in manufacturing and things like that, which is not a bad thing for employment and productivity. Now, what does MMT have to say about any of that? MMT hasn't got very much to say at all about, say, green transition. You're right.
Sorry, I just knocked something over. Carry on.
MMT doesn't have very much at all to say about the green transition, or you call it a Green New Deal.
Yeah.
But what it does have to say is crucial and central and game changing. Because what MMT tells you is that anybody who says you can't afford that is wrong. What MMT tells you, and go back to those two scenarios I raised, is that you may encounter real resource constraints. Now, if we need to fundamentally alter our production and consumption patterns and alter the divert resources from one use to another, that's a major exercise, and that's going to be a huge political headache for governments who have to take resources off carbon intensive industries, for example.
Yeah.
Now, what MMT says, you can do that, but you may need a range of policies to accompany the spending. Yeah. You can't just go in and start building a green economy with your currency power, because you'll hit real resource constraints and you'll have to divert them from other uses through regulation or taxes or what have you. So it's a mix. But MMT understanding says that you would never fall for the argument, we can't afford it.
Yeah, right.
That's plain wrong. British government will be able to sign all the checks, but it may have some political issues on shifting resources around.
Yeah. I've had a plea, Bill, from someone saying, would it be possible to just go on for just a few more minutes, because we're up against our clock here. If you can hang on for another 5 or 10 minutes.
There's demand for our services, Chris.
Seems to be. One which might be helpful, actually, is a question from a lad called Ben Davey. He's saying any book recommendations. I think that would be useful if you could maybe point somebody in the direction. I think you've already referred to one, but
well, look. What we've, and I haven't got it close here, but I would, if you were interested in being studious, then I would read our textbook published by Macmillan. It's Mitchell, Ray and Watts, William Mitchell, Randall Ray and Martin Watts. It's called Macroeconomics, published by Macmillan last year.
Yeah.
Now that's a to Z of modern monetary theory. Now, there are a lot of other resources around. Randy Ray's written a primer, which is really accessible. Warren Mosler has written his 7 deadly fallacies, innocent sins, or whatever you call it, mistruths, and that's available for free if you just search for Warren Mose or seven sins or whatever he calls it. And there's another book, Reclaiming the State, that I wrote with Italian journalist Thomas Fazzi. That's published by Pluto. That's more political economy rather than studious economy, but a lot of people like that book.
Right. Okay. I think one of the things we can do, because what we'll do after this is going out live, but we'll put a link out and people can watch it. That's not been able to tune in today, and we can put some links.
Put a link to my blog and
and obviously recommend some of those books as well, so that we don't lose that.
That'd be great.
Let me just get a couple of questions in before you go, Bill, and I appreciate it because it's 10 o'clock over your end now. You're probably getting ready for supper or whatever. But anyway, it's a question here from somebody called Chester Elmuth, and asking, has a Swedish Riksbank, I'm not quite sure how you pronounce it, anyway, prize committee, to your knowledge, shown that they're aware of MMT as a development in macroeconomics?
The Reichsbank is a central bank.
That's how you pronounce it, is it? Yeah, sorry, mate. Yeah.
People's banks, state banks, central bank.
Yeah.
Well, as you know, that Alfred Nobel didn't award an economics prize. He didn't think economists were worthy of a Nobel Prize at all. So in his will, he didn't bequest any money for an economics Nobel Prize, which is quite insulting to economists. So the Reichsbank of Sweden decided they'd have their own Nobel Prize. Been huge disputes with the Nobel family about that. So when you see these Nobel Prize winners in economics, they're not really Nobel Prize winners. They're just there. It's like I used to say that in cycling, everybody, in veterans cycling, everybody gets a prize. But no, look, they're a neoliberal outfit, and it'll take a major paradigm shift before. In economics before they recognise MMT, I'd say. I think any MMT academic who's got their eyes on a Nobel Prize is delusional.
Right. Yes. Okay. Well, that's something. Somebody's asking you a question. Go on, Bill. Sorry.
We haven't even got to the first step yet, really, of taking over all of the academies.
Yeah.
And that's the way it's going. Monetarism took over the academies. And then it filtered back out to central banks and treasury departments, and then through the bureaucracy, and into the lower parts of academic life. We haven't even got there yet. And when I hear people say, "Oh, MMT's winning," well, no, we're not. We're not winning until we take over the academy, and then we start pushing out graduates to treasuries and central banks. Then we'll lift the glasses and say we've had a victory.
Well, it's gaining ground, though, I think, Bill, and there's certainly a lot more awareness of it, and people are talking about it in a way that I don't think was the case in the past. And I think
definitely.
We can draw some inspiration, can't we, from liberals who, back in, was it 1947 or 48, they set up the Mampallaran Society, and because they were seen as completely
lunatics.
Yes, exactly, yeah, and now kind of they're mainstream. So.
If you study the way paradigm shifts occur in other disciplines, they can take 3 or 4 decades. And if you think about monetarism, as you said, I mean, monetarism was Milton Friedman was banging away in the 1950s, making no sense. And then by the early 70s, he's leading the dominant school of thought. And what happens is the cognitive dissonance grows and grows. Mainstream economics is in tatters. And they've got nothing to say anymore. But those paradigm shifts take a long time to work through, because there's such entrenched interest. Max Planck has this great quote, the German physicist, that paradigms change one funeral at a time. And what he was talking about was that all the top academics in the mainstream paradigm have to die off, and their young people have to come through with the new ideas. That's how paradigms shift. And they take time. I mean, I'm in it for the long haul.
Yeah. Well, I think we all need to be on that score, certainly, Bill. This is probably better be the final question, because we've prevailed on your kind of generosity, I think, already too much, in my opinion. But it's just a question here about somebody asking about countries like Russia. Why aren't they embracing MMT? Why is it not breaking through in some of these places?
Well, what does it mean about embracing it? I mean, the point is that if Russia has a monetary system where the government issues a currency, its central bank sets the interest rate, it floats the currency, and it doesn't borrow in foreign currencies, well, then it's a sovereign government under the MMT lens. So it's not a matter of embracing it. They already do. They've got a monetary system like Australia, like Britain. They're already doing it. Whether they articulate it in the way I do and whether the people understand it in the way I do, that's the question. And that's why I'm constantly involved in educating. That's why I'm talking to you, other than that I'm a mate and that I want to be part of your resistance movement, which is an incredibly important thing for us, I think, for the future. I'm an educator, and I want people to have the same understanding as I have, because that empowers our democracy. We won't tolerate government saying we've got to borrow from the IMF, or we've run out of money, we can't buy proper clothing for our doctors and nurses, or we can't have proper public schools or housing. You know, once everybody has the same understanding of me, that's when the revolution will come, because we won't tolerate it anymore.
Well, that's probably a good place to stop, Bill. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time out. And we've literally been inundated with questions. We could have gone on for another couple of hours or more, actually, but I think that would probably be unfair to you, and we'd probably lose.
Oh, you can have me back if you like.
That would be really good. What I was going to say, though, is, and you mentioned the resistance movement, the Festival of Resistance that we've established now. And we are planning a major conference, Festival of Resistance. We were planning it for the summer, but unfortunately the pandemic has put paid to that. And then we put it back to the autumn, but we've decided to move it again to next year, unfortunately, because I think there will be so many restrictions on people like yourself coming to address it. And you very kindly agreed to come and speak at the festival, which will be a weekend event. The idea behind it is to inspire people. It's not just about having a great conference. That's clearly important. But we want to inspire people so that they, as it were, go back into their local communities and start to build this revolution. And one of the things that we want to do, and one of the things that we've adopted in our aims and objectives so far, our initial aims and objectives anyway, is to get a better understanding, to try and promote a better understanding of economics and an understanding of this MMT lens right across the piece, really. For the very reason that you've outlined, Bill, so that politicians can't get away with saying what they've been saying, that we can't afford to do X, Y, or Z, or you're going to bankrupt the country. This is just a nonsense, and the more that we can explode those myths, I think, then the better the chance of delivering a long-lasting change in the country, bring about an irreversible shift in the balance of wealth and power. And I think this is something which gives us the opportunity to get there.
Yeah,
so
we've got to get all clued up. And just the last thing I'd say is, it surprised me too. I gave a talk at the Woodford Folk Festival last December, and that's a very big festival in Australia where has arts and crafts and poets and musicians, and I gave a talk, and at the end of it, some young people came up to me, really young, and they were sort of, they had a feral look about them, as young hippies these days at folk festivals have, like probably I looked like when I was 20. And the thing was that they said to me, this is the first time we've had hope that there's an alternative way forward for everybody. And that really struck me, because it's the youth that's going to push all of our movements along, and they haven't had any hope.
No.
The neoliberal system, the gig economy, has ground them into the ground.
Yeah.
And that was a really important lesson to me, that a progressive agenda, well articulated, can really resonate with the young people that we've really killed off through austerity, killed off in material prosperity terms. And I'm really happy that you're doing, I'm really going to be very excited to come to Britain and be part of the.
Thank you, Bill. Because I mean, and the other thing that we want this movement to be is not just focused on the UK, important though that is. We want to be very much an internationalist movement, an anti-imperialist movement, and we want to give people hope. You know, when Jeremy got the leadership of the Labour Party, that was one of the greatest things, I think, that once again hope had been injected, and it really did mobilize literally millions of people. And I think there was a potential which sadly, you know, wasn't built upon as strongly as I think it perhaps could have been. But the wonderful quote that I often use on public platforms in relation to hope is from the Shawshank Redemption, and in fact I quoted it the other day on one of these programs actually, where Andy Dufresne says to Red Redding, "Hope is a good thing, maybe the best of things, and no good thing ever dies." And I think if we can give people hope, you're giving people hope, I think, Bill, with the work that you're doing. And if we can, you know, take this on and be champions of this lens, this MMT lens, I think it really does give us huge potential for the future. And it will be the younger generation, as it were, that will carry the torch forward in that sense.
Well, as I mentioned to you, that we're creating a movement here called Just 2030.
Fantastic, yeah.
And I've got sort of dialogue going with people in Japan, with people in West Africa, with people in Europe, with people in Timor, to become parts of Just 2030, and Just 2030 can then dovetail straight into your resistance movement. And so we're starting to get global dialogues and sharing and activity sharing, and I think that's a way forward.
I absolutely agree. Very important, and certainly be delighted to be part of that movement. And I think, you know, a lot of people have been very depressed about the general election outcome in Britain, very depressed about the destruction of the Corbyn project inside the Labour Party. Many people are sticking with the Labour Party and hoping that they can bring about change inside the party. I think that's a forlorn proposition. Yeah. And I think people will be better using their energies, some if not all of their energies, on developing a sort of movement, a political movement outside the kind of traditional party political structure. Because I think party political structures are breaking down all over the world, and there's massive potential for us, I think, to mobilize communities, because there's a lot of cynicism.
Yeah, we can create our own future outside of all of that history and baggage that constrains our traditional progressive parties. And has rendered them useless. We've got to create our own future and our own tradition and our own movements, and that's I'm convinced of that.
Well, it's in our hands, and the old Labour movement maxim that unity is strength and an injury to one is an injury to all, and solidarity and all that is so important. I mean, they kind of maybe sound like a bit like cliches, but there is an inherent truth in that. And if people could recognize the strength, and that's what we're hoping to try and do with this movement, the strength of their collective solidarity, well, anything's possible. Literally anything is possible. So that's what we need to sort of, I think, hold close to our hearts as we go forward, and remember that line from the Shawshank Redemption about hope. Yeah. But thanks again, Bill, and thanks everybody for tuning in and watching another edition of Resistance TV. Apologies, as is always the way, we've not had time to take all of the questions, but thank you very much indeed for posing them. We'll put some links out to various publications, put a link out to Bill's blog that he produces on a regular basis. I've got to urge anybody who's interested and they're around and they've got a spare hour to kill on Wednesday evening. The next broadcast from Resistance TV will be speaking to Nick Beddoes about community organising, and that's going to be a fascinating presentation. Community organising is going to be so important as we build this movement going forward. So thanks again for watching, and thank you again, Bill, for your time, and goodbye from me and goodbye from Bill. Thanks very much indeed.
Okay.